Welcome to Elevating Consciousness, the podcast that helps you discover deeper levels of truth, meaning, and wholeness. I'm your host, Artem, and our guest today is the founder of Aletheia, a professional coach training school that trains coaches in a paradigm-shifting, next-generation coaching approach. He has over 18 years of experience as a professional coach, 20 plus years as a professional instructional designer and trainer, as well as 16 years of working in the field of software development and manager of organizational development. He specializes in helping leaders and teams thrive in complex situations by applying their innate resourcefulness and creativity to resolve the problems they face. Steve March, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Yeah, so I'm just really curious about your background and like some of the pivotal events that inspired you to get into coaching and the work that you do today.
Yeah, so I got into coaching in the year 2000, thereabouts, something like that. And I was in the middle of my tech career. So I was, my original training is all in computer science. And so that's what I went to university for. And basically from there got into software engineering, and then eventually throughout my career sort of moved into management and moved from the technology side onto the people side. And I was working on, an organizational development team, and I was kind of in the middle of conversations with executives trying to help them to show up differently at their meetings. It's like be more approachable, how to resolve conflict, how to work with their employees. And essentially, I was trying to coach them, but I didn't know that that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to help them, right? And I didn't know exactly what I was doing, how I was doing it. And then I met someone who introduced himself to me as a coach. And I was like, what's that? And I knew sports coaching, of course, but I was like, that's clearly not what he was talking about. And when he started to describe what he was doing, I realized, oh, that's what I'm trying to do. But I didn't have the word. I didn't know anything about this field at all. And essentially, I went from meeting him to getting myself into some coach training because, to be really frank, I needed it. I really, I was trying to do it, but I was sort of faltering. And I was at that time like a student of developmental psychology and integral theory. And I was trying to bring a lot of these different things in, but I really didn't have a way to do it. And so, long story short, basically I went through coach training, got myself a basic methodology that I could use, and spent a long time in that methodology, both using it and also teaching it. And then I started to get curious about other ways of working, and that sort of began to lead me in a very, very different direction. That is now what I teach and what I practice inside of Aletheia. And I can talk more about that if you're interested. But that's basically how I kind of got into this, was just switching from being focused on technology to being focused on people, and then suddenly realizing there was a whole world there that I could move into. And so now I've been, like I say, coaching for about 22 years, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. So I definitely want to dive into your approach to coaching. But before we do that, I want to know how do you conceptualize coaching? What is coaching? Who is it for? And maybe then you can also like speak on the unfoldment paradigm and how that's different than the more traditional approach to coaching.
Yeah. So coaching is, coaching is essentially a kind of help that we offer to our clients. And oftentimes the question comes like, how is coaching different from psychotherapy? And that's not an easy question to answer. I don't know if that was sort of implied in what you were asking or not.
It actually wasn't, but that was another question I had. So feel free to just integrate all that in there. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, many people have tried to make the distinction between coaching and psychotherapy, as I did oftentimes, on methodological grounds, like, to say, well, a therapist would do this, and as a coach, I would do that. And no matter what kind of this is and that's that I might name, And I've had psychotherapists in my coach training classes, and very frequently when I try to do that, they will say things like, well, Steve, actually, what you described that you do as a coach, I also do as a therapist. But when I watch you work, what you say I do as a therapist, you're also doing as a coach. And so making the distinction on methodological grounds doesn't really work very well. Where I think it makes more sense to talk about it is in terms of scope of practice. So like, who are the clients that we're actually working with, and what exactly are we offering, right? So if I'm a psychotherapist, I'm working with a particular set of clients, and oftentimes they're coming with psychological issues that many therapists will actually diagnose using something like the DSM or something like that. And, so therapists are taking that particular view. Now, it's also the case that many, many therapists don't take that pathologizing view. And so we're back into the problem. In some cases, there's actually a lot of overlap between the scope of practice of coaches and therapists. There may be some edge cases where therapists will work with somebody who is, experiencing complex trauma or addiction issues or, more serious mental health issues. Clearly, those are outside of the scope of practice for coaches. And on the other side, maybe some coaches are working with trying to help their clients with very, very specific, domain-specific issues. How to deal with, let's say, board politics. If they're a leader in a publicly traded company. Very specific. You have to have domain expertise in order to even understand the issues and navigate that space. That's out of scope for therapists. But there's this huge overlap, especially for developmental coaches, where we're working with the same kind of population. But the big problem is that the last time I checked, there were over 1,000 styles of psychotherapy. And so sometimes when people ask me the question to distinguish, I'll say, first define therapy, and then I'll tell you how coaching is different, which usually stops people in their tracks, because therapy itself is so many different things that in any kind of simple phrase, it's sort of not definable, right?
Yeah.
But essentially, back to your original question, coaching is basically what I do as a coach is I help my clients to develop new ways of being and to learn skills that allow them to navigate through life with more effectiveness, more fulfillment, more ease. And we are all facing lives that are complex by nature, and it's very easy to feel stuck or confused or overwhelmed or unbalanced, things like that. And so how do we actually learn to navigate the complexity that we face? Because it's complex by nature, which means that you can't reduce the complexity of life. Human relationships are complex by nature. They're not going to suddenly become simple, right? So if it's complex by nature and that's never going to change, how do we actually learn to navigate that complexity? And that's a lot of what I do as a coach.
Yeah. And maybe this is a good time to kind of introduce the unfoldment paradigm and how that's different than the traditional approach to coaching of self-improvement.
Right. Yeah. So I look at the coaching industry, which has been around maybe about 40 years-ish, 45 years, something like that, as having like different generations of coaching methodology. The early coaching methodology was very much borrowed from sports coaching, where, the coach would kind of watch you in action and then say, here, do this and not that, right? Very much giving you feedback can be helpful, but it's not necessarily developmental. There are many stages of the unfoldment of coaching methodology. What I'm teaching in Aletheia, I believe, is an example of the fourth generation of coaching methodology. Kind of like the leading edge of the emergence of coaching methodology. And one of the ways that I frame that is by contrasting self-improvement with unfoldment. So in the self-improvement style of coaching, we usually go into that because we feel some lack, some sense of deficiency. I can't do this, I can't do that, I'm stuck, something must be missing in me. And naturally, when something is missing, what we want to do is we want to develop it. We want to cultivate it. We want to in some way improve ourselves. And the first kind of coaching that I learned was very much a self-improvement style. In fact, we were trained as coaches to listen for what's missing, right? And so that's one of the keys is if you find yourself listening for what's missing, if you find yourself trying to identify the deficiency, then you're doing self-improvement style coaching. But what I recognized after trying that kind of approach for well over a decade is that very often when we start with that sense of deficiency and we try to improve, we actually unintentionally wind up reinforcing the sense of deficiency, right? So we see this, my simple example is like New Year's resolutions, right? So it's like, how many times have we, had some New Year's resolution with good intention, we want to improve ourselves, and we go forth and a week in, 2 weeks in, 3 weeks in, we're faltering, we're struggling, and we conclude after we give up, gee, maybe I don't have what it takes. I don't have enough discipline. I don't have enough perseverance. I don't have enough commitment. And so it's like, if we stumble on that path of self-improvement, we actually wind up in a worse situation where we're reinforcing the sense of deficiency, which is exactly the thing we were trying to escape from, right? And even if our self-improvements succeed, very often we improve in some way, and that improvement just seems to cast a shadow on the rest of our life and say, well, gee, I need that everywhere else in life. And so I'm also now still feeling this deficiency. And so I kind of call this the self-improvement hamster wheel or the self-improvement trap. Like, the more self-improvement we do, the more self-improvement it seems that we need. And so it's kind of, you never get to some end point where you go, now I feel good. Now I feel complete. So I began wondering, after being in that world for a while and seeing that happen, like, could there be an alternative? Like, is there some other way to approach this? And that's what I call the unfolding approach. And the unfolding approach starts in a very different place. I provocatively ask, like, what if nothing is missing? And I don't mean this in a naive sense. Like, there's a lot of things I can't do, right? But that doesn't mean that something is missing in me as a human being. Like, what if who we are, both of us sitting here right here, you and on the East Coast, me on the West Coast, like, what if we're already whole human beings? Like, that's the kind of the premise. And very often my clients will say, well, it doesn't feel like that. It feels like something is missing. And I say, well, how does that actually feel? Like, can you actually notice and experience the something missing? Like, what does it feel like? And so what we start to do is we start to go into the body, we start to explore emotions, we start to explore the feeling of something missing. And now we're talking about something that's tangibly here, like a feeling, like a bodily felt sense, like a something here, as opposed to something not here. And that shift into unfolding, as we begin to explore what is here, what we notice is what's here unfolds, and it unfolds in depth. And as we explore what's here, as we feel our emotions and sense our bodies and explore our thoughts, that we actually drop in contact, deeper and deeper contact with ourselves, where we actually discover the actual feeling of wholeness. We actually can land into a depth in which we feel innately whole and complete, and it shifts our entire experience of ourselves. We land into what I call qualities of presence. We land into innate value. We land into love. We land into compassion. We land into acceptance. We can land into confidence. We can land into courage. Like, these kinds of human virtues are, in fact, exactly what's needed to navigate the complexity that we face. When you look at the world, it's a call for courageous action. It's a call for stepping forth and offering love, offering compassion. And that offer comes not from some deficient self. It comes from who we are, who you are as a whole. So the whole idea here is that we start with the premise of wholeness, and then we simply explore what's here until we explore it enough to actually land into it. And then we turn around and look at life, which often looks very different. And different responses to life then come automatically from that. So that's really the big shift in paradigm from self-improvement to unfoldment. And I find it to be really powerful and very kind of life-supported, life-affirming kind of coaching that really allows the client and the coach to sort of wrestle with the complexity of life, to fully face into it, to not put blinders on or anything, to fully face into it, because only that will actually bring forth the unfoldment of the response.
Yeah, it's really counterintuitive, but that simple shift from looking for what's missing to looking for what's here, it's like it's something that brings you into the present moment. It brings you into presence, and it allows the transformation to just happen. And I guess what I'm curious about is also if you could unpack what you call the parts, process, and presence model of development. I'm actually fascinated with human development and developmental stage theories. And I'm always piecing things together and trying to see it through my own kind of unique theory. And I think it maps well with what you talk about in parts, process, and presence. So I'm just curious how you conceptualize those things and how you put them together.
Yeah. Well, maybe I can also tell kind of the origin story of that model.
Yeah, please. Absolutely.
Like how that model kind of unfolded for me is that, as I said, I went through this original coach training back in 2000, 2001, 2002. And like many coaches after their initial training, I said, this is great. I want more. And so I went out and I learned a bunch of other methods. And, I spent, to be honest, like most of the next decade, like taking training classes, learning methods, learning styles of psychotherapy, styles of coaching, styles of somatic work, all kinds of different things. And the thing that was most striking to me was that they were all so different from each other. All these methods are so different, but they all work. And I was like, how is that even possible? Like, I thought that it would be like everybody's coaching or offering therapy to human beings. We probably all have variations on a theme. Like, probably everything is just more or less the same thing, because we're working with human beings, and human beings are human beings. And this was just my naivete to recognize that human beings are vastly complex, and in fact, we need a lot of different ways of working with ourselves. And so I was surprised. They're all different, but they all work. But I also noticed they all fail to work. Like, and this is what happens. Like, you get one method and it works with the first 3 people, and then it doesn't work with the next 6 people. And you're like, hang on a minute, like, it was working, now it's not working. Like, and so this is a real challenge for a lot of people, because they get committed to a particular method and then they just want to see everything in those terms. And so what I realized, I kind of sort of grabbed a hold of this question, like, and this phenomena, like, what explains this? Different methods, they all work, they all fail to work. How is that even possible? And then I had an integrating insight, and I said they all work at different depths. And so when a client is at a particular depth of self-contact or contact with others in the world, then meeting them there with a method that specializes at that depth is very skillful, and it will work. But if the client is at a different depth of contact, meeting them there with that same method won't be as skillful. And that explained why it worked and why it doesn't work for these methods. So I began to wonder, because I had this background in integral theory. So immediately I began to think, like, could there be a method that understood depth and that integrated all the different moves of these different methodologies and kind of tracked the client in terms of the depth that they were at, and then basically met them with the methodology that was most skillful at that depth. And so the first experiments that I started to do, I thought, well, I've got this depth. There's sort of the shallow depth of parts. Then the depth of process is deeper. Then the depth of presence and absence is even deeper. Then the depth of non-duality, the deepest depth. And I thought that mostly I was seeing clients and I was seeing they were at the shallowest depth. And I knew that the more I worked with them, the more access they had to the deeper depths. So I tried to coach them at one depth for a while and then graduate them to the next depth and so on. And I found that that didn't really work because since I was sensitive to depth, what I noticed is that even in the span of a single coaching conversation, the client was navigating up and down in the depths, back and forth, back and forth. And so I couldn't just change methods in that way. One method for, say, 6 months, and then another method for 6 months, and then another method for 6 months, or something like that. That I had to actually have these methods formed in a way with like gestures or moves that I could do with clients as they're fluidly moving up and down in these depths. What I saw, though, if you stand back and kind of look over a long stretch of time, you can see a kind of developmental stage model sort of unfolding in the client's life. And what I noticed is that with more development, we have a greater capacity to inhabit more of our depth, not just the deeper depths, but the entire span or range of depth. And so it is possible to take this sort of ontology of depth and understand it in terms of developmental stage models. And so what I noticed is that basically I'm just practicing in the moment, in the present moment with the client. And oftentimes we're moving up and down in the depths. And as we practice that, the client is learning to inhabit more range of their depth consciously, and over time that develops them.
Yeah, and I think I kind of understand what you mean by depth, but I kind of want to unpack that a little bit and kind of tell you what I'm thinking. But to me, it's like when you talk about depth and you talk about, let's say the highest or the lowest depth, right? Like I don't even know how to say it, but say we're at the least amount of depth, we actually are most ego identified, and maybe the most contracted identified were our thoughts. And then as we go into more depth, there becomes like maybe less contraction, more expansion, less identifying with our ego, more of kind of like this open awareness space. And that's what you're saying. And for everybody that changes, right? Like I could, in my own experience, there's times where I'm very contracted, very identified with the ego. And then there's other times where I'm less contracted, I'm more open. There's the self starts to lose its like sense of being solid. There's more of a fluidity. And I think that's what you're getting at.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So at the shallower depths, the depth of parts, the way you can tell that you're actually at the depth of parts is that when you look around in terms of the world and when you peer inwardly, what you see is separation. So, and this is usually the depth that we navigate life in. It's a very pragmatic and practical depth to be in. When you navigate through your house, walk through your house, or drive through the city, or whatever you're doing, it's really important to understand where things are, that things are separate from us, right? Because we can move through the spaces and things like that. When we look inwardly, though, what we notice is that we have parts of our ego structure. There's the part of me that felt hurt when I was a little kid, and that part is still here. And there's a part of me that, really tries to defend me from ever feeling hurt that way again. And we have lots of different defenses. We have parts that are ambitious, that really are trying to do good in the world. And the average psychologically healthy adult has something like 30 to 50 parts. That's just a rough approximation. So the thing is that when we peer inwardly, we're actually very complex on the inside. We have whole constellations of parts, and different parts are getting triggered at different times. They're not all running and active at the same moment. So one part gets triggered, other parts get triggered, and we run into situations where we have parts that are both triggered, but that want us to do opposite things. Like, classic scenario might be something like a part of me that really wants me to quit my job because it's a toxic workplace and the job is killing me. But then there's another part of me that says, hey man, the economy's not doing so well. You've got a job. Hang on to that. You need the money. And guess what? Both parts are trying to take care of us, but who's the good guy and who's the bad guy? Well, they're both good guys, right? So we feel stuck in the middle of something like that, or we feel stuck in a relationship. Like part of me says, oh, I want to move on. I'm done with this relationship. Other part says, maybe this could work out. Like you should hang in there, tough it out, And so the thing about all these parts is that we can get pulled in a lot of different directions, a lot of inner tensions, and what this leads to is stress. And so here we are living in this complex world with everything is accelerating, and there's just information overload, and we've got these parts that are all trying to deal with all of that and getting triggered left and right, and they're trying to be helpful, but very often they're just leading to us feeling stressed and intense and stuck. And, so that's like what life is like at the depth of parts. And it's mostly where we're living. Now, if we learn how to practice parts work, which is one of the ways that in Aletheia coaching, we work with this, right? We're working with these parts. We connect with the parts, we relate to those parts, and we relate to their good intentions. And we love them and appreciate them for their good intentions. And when the part feels seen and understood in that deep way, in that way where it feels completely accepted as it is, what happens is it relaxes. And in that relaxation, there is a spontaneous dropping in depth. We drop down into the depth of process. The depth of process feels a lot like a kind of fluidity, like you're talking about, right? It's kind of fluid. We notice a lot of it is like feelings, right? So we notice bodily felt senses, the flow of feeling through our body, the flow of emotion. But here, these aren't reactive emotions. These are more like existential emotions, like the feeling of being. Like the feeling of being in this place is this. If I move over here, it feels a little bit different. There's a flow that we can move through. And at this depth of process, we actually get access to a kind of, what's going on in our relationships. So relatedness is most easily navigated at this depth. And what happens is that things are moving. So it's not actually possible to get stuck at the depth of process. It's like plunking yourself in the middle of a river and the river just carries you along, right? So if you drop into the river of experience, it will carry you along and help you navigate these complex relationships. So every time I'm working with especially people in relational jobs like managers or leaders, like getting them to access this depth of process is super important because it's what allows them to actually feel what's going on in the relationships as opposed to just acting from their parts, which are very defensive, right? And then if you follow that flow and process, what will actually happen is that flow is not going in a random direction. It's going toward the realization of who we are in our wholeness. And so the more we follow that flow, the more we see an opening. I call it a portal that kind of opens up in our experience where we sort of drop in one more time. And when we drop into that, this is a kind of open awareness state that you named. This kind of open awareness, we drop in and we actually drop into presence. And presence is quality rich, like love and compassion and will and courage and peacefulness and joy and all kinds of different virtues. And we recognize ourselves as being a compassionate presence or a courageous presence or a loving presence or a persevering presence, right? And that capacity, that groundedness in our own beingness at this depth actually helps us to navigate the complexity of the world. And then if we actually hang there long enough, we'll also realize absence, because presence and absence co-arise at this depth. They're like yin and yang in Taoist philosophy. They're sort of mutual. And what can happen is if we really open up to embracing both absence and presence, this is one of the ways to actually drop into the deepest depth of non-duality. And as we drop into non-duality, the hallmark experience is one of non-separation, kind of like the opposite of the depth of parts, where the hallmark, the central experience was separation. So here we feel really deeply, deeply held, deeply belonging in the world. We feel like we're exactly where we belong, exactly in the world. Dropping into non-duality has all kinds of benefits. It sparks creativity. It allows us to feel a sense of safety and security, which if we're struggling with any kind of attachment issues, like this is a place of secure base, of ultimate security, where we drop in, we feel more trusting of ourselves, and trusting of our capacity to navigate situations in which there's distrust, right? And there's lots of other things that can come from that. So it's like actually having access to this like stack of depth, these 4 different depths, gives us access to all kinds of resources for navigating life, for orienting in life, for sense making, for stepping in, for bringing all of ourselves into life. So that's really what I think development is it's learning to bring your whole self in.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and as you're talking, I can kind of go through those different depths, and for me, it's like you say, the parts one is like we're very much in our head, everything's rational, everything's mental, and then like I do this practice called circling. So in circling, usually you start out, people come in and you're very much in your head, telling stories, about what happened yesterday, what's going to happen tomorrow, and then as you learn, you come down into what I believe is what you call process, and it becomes this kind of fluid, and it's really about feelings and what's here right now. And then as you stay, and you can still have like feelings, and you're still kind of relating. And then as you stay deeper and you get calmer, and a lot of times it starts happening in silence, that's when the presence really opens up for me. It's like you sense that there's open awareness, and you're just very present. There's like this, for me, a sense of like luminosity. Everything's just kind of vibrant and alive, and the mind is very quiet. And right. And then, but then the next stage, and this is what's interesting, like the non-dual, and it seems like those 3 of parts, process, and presence. It feels like with a little bit of training, most people can kind of, even somebody who's really much in their head, they can experience those things. But now I'm really curious about the non-dual part and kind of how that came about for you, because I guess it's one thing to read about these things, and you could read a lot of spiritual books that explain all these states and everything, but it's another to actually have a non-dual state and experience and know that, oh, that's actually possible, and feel the sense of separation dissolve, and like, oh wow, the ego is an illusion in a way. So I'm just curious what your experience was with non-duality, like how that came in your life beyond like reading about it or hearing about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's a story with many chapters to talk about, like how I got sort of progressively introduced into non-dual teachings. Probably the short version of the story is, I got turned on to Buddhism, when I was, probably, I'm going to say about 30 years ago, approximately, maybe 28 years ago, something like that. At that point, it was exactly as you describe. I was reading these things, but it wasn't making any sense to me. And being in that tradition for a while, and then I was in the Diamond Approach, which is a tradition
A.H. Almas.
from A.H. Almas. Yeah. So I was in that, inside that particular school, working with Hamid and Karen, the 2 founders of the school, were my primary teachers, and working with them for about 14 years or so. And then even as I left that school, because I kind of felt after a while I needed to kind of pick my head up and look around a bit, all throughout that I've kind of continued practicing and in various forms of Buddhism. But it's sort of like, for me, it was kind of a gradual unfolding for a while. And then particularly studying and working in some of the Tibetan Buddhist practices, the Mahamudra, things like that, having some sudden awakening experiences. But the way that comes into Aletheia, and by the way, we actually need to have non-dual work in Aletheia, because what will happen is that with the method, we meet the client exactly where they are, and they spontaneously drop in depth. And so what has happened, even in our level 1 courses, now doesn't happen frequently, but it has happened more than once, where a student will work with a client, meet them exactly where they are, and do a really good job of it, and the client will actually drop straight into non-duality. And so, because the dropping in depth is never something that we do, it's a grace. So, and the work that we do, I sometimes talk about unfolding as a dance of work and grace. The work that we do, the things that we're practicing and helping our clients to practice, are simply ways of opening more to grace. And so the unfoldment is a grace. It's actually something that is doing itself. In fact, many of my coaches will remark, especially in level 1, like, it feels like I'm not doing anything, or they're amazed at the effortlessness of it, because all the big movements, the big shifts that clients experience happen not because the coach did it. The coach doesn't make some sort of big move and then suddenly the client has an epiphany or something like that. It's more like the coach invites the client to be exactly where they are, and then something unfolds. And what unfolds is just as much a surprise to the client as it is to the coach, right? So that's the grace. But in Aletheia, we have 4 different styles of ego transformation that we work on. And they're really 4 different styles of non-dual work. So I sort of talked about the first style. The first style is we have an experience of presence, which is an experience of ourselves as presence. That's the only way to experience presence, is as yourself. And then an experience of absence. And in some ways, these are sort of like diametrically opposing experiences. And so what we can do is, once we have access to both the quality of presence and absence, is actually feel them together at the same time. And this duality, in a sense, as we feel them together at the same time, these two things kind of cancel each other out, and we drop straight into non-duality. That's one style of non-dual work. This is what I call the gradual style, because it takes sort of gradually working with parts and working through process and working through presence, and then finding both the presence and the absence, and then holding them together, and then so there's a sort of gradual process, and it sometimes takes a while for clients to get to the point where they can do this kind of non-dual work. And by a while, it could be anything from a year or a few years to 5 years, even, very gradually working through the psychology, opening the psychology more and more to being able to be permeable to depth, right, and acclimating to that. And the gradual approach is really, really important. It's kind of like the baseline to establish. Everybody needs a basic gradual approach to doing self-development. But at a certain point in time, that gradual approach will kind of plateau. And that doesn't mean it's over, but it just means that something is being missed by that method. And that's the sign to shift gears. And I usually use this metaphor of shifting like a manual transmission car, like shifting into second gear. And second gear is the second style of transformation. This is the sudden awakening approach. And this is very much influenced by Buddhism, especially forms of Tibetan Buddhism, but you see it there in all forms of Buddhism. And in sudden awakening, what we actually do is we shift into a way of looking for ourselves. We're looking for the self. In Tibetan Buddhism, this is called an analytic meditation, right? Or sometimes people will call it an unfindable inquiry, because indeed, when we go looking for the self, it's not findable, right? When we go looking for the other, that's not findable. When we go looking for phenomena, that's not findable. When we go looking for space, that's not findable. When we go looking for the body, that's not findable. When we go looking for time itself, that's not findable. And what we notice is that it's not findable in the separate, isolated way that we take it to be. But what is findable, so to speak, is non-dual presence itself. And so all of this is arising as non-dual presence. And we can actually do that kind of in this sort of sudden awakening style and pop into non-dual presence. And so what's interesting is if you look at these depths, it's like the gradual approach starts at the shallow depth and sort of gradually, kind of up and down, but gradually goes lower and lower and lower. What I notice is that the gradual approach is really effective at those shallower depths. Like you say, like most people with a little bit of training can get the first 3 depths, right? It's that 4th depth that takes a long time to get to, that depth of non-duality. But then you shift into the sudden awakening approach, which goes from the depth of parts, where we see things as separate, to not being able to find those separate things. And we go from there directly into non-duality. So sometimes I call it the express train. It skips all the local stops, right? It just goes from one thing direct to the destination, direct to non-duality. So if you kind of like take these 2 approaches and you kind of overlap them, you find that their strengths, their relative strengths and weaknesses complement each other, right? And so what you need is you need you need this complementary approach, right? That actually takes you into the 3rd style of transformation, which can be understood as a union of the first 2 styles, But what makes the difference here is by this time in the 3rd style of transformation, what we can actually do is at the beginning of practice, we actually drop into non-dual presence. And it's non-dual presence itself that does the practice. And that completely changes things in a profound way to actually start our transformational work as non-dual presence, as opposed to starting it as a separate ego self. And there, what we wind up doing is we wind up kind of recapitulating a sort of ego-formative process in which we sort of like reassemble ourselves in a kind of way, navigating from the depth of non-duality up through the depths this time, just like we did in the original ego formation that happened at the beginning of life, in the first 3 years of life, where we navigated up through the depths as ego was built. So, but this time, as we sort of go through ego formation, we don't wind up with an ego that separates us, because it's non-dual awareness that is actually, or non-dual presence that's actually doing the practice. Instead, what we wind up is sort of inhabiting an enlightened realm, right? We're inhabiting the depths in the way that we inhabit the surface, right? Which is a profound transformation. This is essentially what Tantra is about. What the path of Buddhist Tantra, as I've experienced it, is probably the closest thing the closest parallel that I can have to that. And then we move into the 4th style of transformation, which is radically different, so radically different that we have to sort of drop all dichotomy. So we can't even say that it's dual or non-dual. We can't say things exist or not exist, right? But curiously, what happens there in that 4th style is, once again, just like the 3rd style, it is non-dual presence itself that is doing the practice, except it's non-dual presence itself that is even transcending itself as non-dual. Right? So to say there's something as non-dual is still to hang on to some vestige of a dichotomy between non-dual and dual. And so even that must be let go of. And so at the end, we can't really describe the experience as non-dual, right? And that's a further and deeper and even more radically profound style of ego transformation. So not only do we have ways of navigating these depths, but once you understand depths, you can actually see that there's 4 different ways that you can actually understand transformation. And this actually has been really helpful for me to realize, because remember, like the origin story that I told about my discovery of the depths, that really helped me to explain and to be in conversation with other, therapists and coaches and spiritual practitioners, because I could tell that many times the ways that we were maybe disagreeing with each other or had different views were just because we were talking at different depths. That in fact, there was a view that actually could embrace the truths of all those depths. But then I started to notice that also different styles of therapy, coaching, and spiritual work also we're preferencing different kinds of ego transformation. So some were talking more in a gradual unfolding style, some were talking more in a sudden awakening style, some were talking more in a kind of union style. Some were talking more about this sort of like beyond, I call it the beyond or the mystery, or the language there at that 4th style is just doesn't work as well. So I could begin to see that the different traditions were preferencing different ego transformation styles. But once again, there's a more encompassing view that would enable us to appreciate all of them, and actually help to see how certain styles of transformation had strengths and weaknesses that were complemented by the strengths and weaknesses of other styles.
Yeah, there's so many moving pieces there, and it's like your
Right.
understanding of development, it really is like very integrated, and that's the way I like to think about human development. Like, what is the most integrated version of human development? And in what you're talking about, I see so many different pieces from A.H. Almas's diamond approach. Like, you talk about presence and different qualities of presence. He speaks a lot about that. And you spoke about your own journey of doing different spiritual practices. And you did say that it, like, eventually you kind of came to like Dzogchen, Mahamudra, Tibetan Buddhism, and that's what's alive for me right now, because that's, for the last year, that's actually the lineage I've been practicing is Tibetan Buddhism, Mahamudra, Dzogchen. This is Dan Brown's lineage that I work with.
Yeah, right. I studied with Dan.
Yeah. So I'm working with basically his top teacher. That Dan recently passed away, but
right.
Also a very fascinating approach that he has to human development and psychology and spirituality. And I am curious about. I mean, there's many things I'm curious about what you shared. I guess what comes up though is I've read one on your website. You said that there isn't the right style of meditation. There isn't one right style of meditation, and you see these different practices, and and something works for one person, something works for another person. So I'm just curious, how does one distinguish what works for them, and what does that depend on, and like what is your thinking around that? Like, how do you help somebody discover like what practice they should be doing, because there's so much to choose from?
Yeah. It's a great question, and we run into this all the time. There's so much information available on YouTube and the internet and things like that, meditation apps, and people will find some meditation practice. And, when I start to work with them, I'll say, talk to me about your practices, and they'll say, I meditate. And I literally have to say, instruct me in your meditation as if you want me to do it, so that I understand what you're actually doing, because meditation is so many different things that someone says I meditate, that literally means nothing, right? You have no idea what they're actually doing. By the way, these 4 styles of ego transformation, they kind of unfold in one after the other as I was working through the perspective of Aletheia coaching and sort of elaborating the model. Looking at my own experience, what I was seeing with my clients and students, and working through that. Later, I discovered, much to my surprise, that the 4 styles of ego transformation actually line up perfectly with the 4 yogas of Mahamudra, which I had, in theory, I had received a teaching on that probably from Dan even, years before. but somehow I wasn't connecting the dots. So maybe they were connected somehow in here, and it sort of unfolded that way. And then I kind of actually recognized the connection later. The other funny thing is that in the diamond approach, Hamid has articulated 4 turnings of the teaching. And when I first heard him present that, I could understand the first 2 turnings, but then I kind of got confused, and it seemed he was, for me, I experienced him as being uncharacteristically vague or unclear about distinguishing those things. He's usually extremely clear in his teaching, and maybe it was me, maybe it was the teaching, I don't know. Anyway, I couldn't get it when I first heard it. And then many years later, he came out with the book, The Alchemy of Freedom, in which he describes the 4 turnings. And I read that, and lo and behold, the 4 turnings also map directly to these 4 styles of ego transformation. So I think that there's a pattern here that my point is that has been recognized in different traditions, not just something that I made up, but something that I tripped over and rediscovered, and then found evidence for and support for. But essentially, that is one of the things that gives rise to different kinds of meditation. So in our more advanced classes, our level 3 and level 4 classes, we actually teach a meditation system that's very similar to, although not identical to, the stages of meditation in Mahamudra. But essentially what we're doing is we're practicing, what is meditation at the depth of parts? There's a certain style of concentration meditation there, or shamatha, right? What is meditation at the depth of process? If you meditate at the depth of parts with good instruction, your practice will spontaneously drop into the depth of process. But you have to understand that you've dropped in depth, and that the object of meditation is now different at that depth.
Yeah.
Because sometimes what you may drop in depth and something else is starting to happen, but you're thinking, well, wait a second, I'm not doing the practice as I've been instructed. I need to go back to the object that I was instructed to pay attention to. But what that does is it just pulls you back into the depth of parts. So you need to be sort of taught and in a relationship with a coach or a teacher who can say, yes, actually what's happening is you've just dropped in depth. Now notice, here's the object of meditation at this depth. And if you do that well, you will spontaneously drop into the next depth. And as you drop from the depth of process into the depth of presence and absence, you go from what is often called concentration with support to concentration without support, into that open awareness state, right? And so it's helpful to understand that there is a progression that naturally can happen. And once more, you can go from that sort of gradual concentration into sudden awakening, which in the Buddhist sense in Tibetan Buddhism would be vipassana, right? These kind of special insight practice, right? And then so on and so forth, things begin to move, etc. What I find is very often people are given a very advanced practice, like that 4th style of transformation. Someone might be given just a sort of, in Mahamudra, it would be called non-meditation practice, or a zazen, like an open shikantaza, open awareness, just sit. There's no instruction. Any instruction we give will actually not be the practice, right? The challenge with that is that it's so simple that it's tempting to teach that to beginners. And why give them all these distinctions and all these minutiae of the stages of practice if in the end that all has to be let go of? Which totally makes sense. So let's just give them the advanced practice. In fact, the story that I have, which I think is true, is that when the Tibetan Buddhism first started to come into the West, many of the teachers were saying, we should just teach Dzogchen. Let's not go through all this other stuff, all these stages and Buddhist Tantra and preliminary practices and the Nondual and everything like that. Let's just go straight for Dzogchen, because in some ways that parallels what Zen was doing. But what they learned is that very often people felt lost in those practices, and they struggled with those practices in ways that were resolvable by actually teaching basic competencies and skills, which then had them recreate the stage-wise path to that. So it can be very difficult if you're not familiar with it, with a stage-wise path, to have some sense of where you are on that path and what's the practice that's appropriate for you to be on that path at that particular stage. So unfortunately, the answer isn't like, how do you know you're on the right, you have the right practice for you? It's best to be in conversation with and in relationship with a teacher or a coach or someone who has a map of the terrain and can locate you on that map and can help you navigate that terrain with some skillfulness and some wisdom, right? That's ultimately the answer.
Yeah, I appreciate those insights and the way that you use the depth and how it maps actually with different meditation practices. And it's interesting because, like, in the Zen style, do nothing, zazen, just sit. It's
Right.
like the most simple, but it's also it's the hardest to do for somebody, I think, especially for the Western mind, where we're all about doing things. So if you give somebody that practice, they're just like, what am I supposed to do? It's like, no, you're supposed to do nothing. And it's like, oh, how do I do nothing?
Right.
And because they're still kind of predominantly in the parts depth, like in this shallow space. So they don't know how to let go and just relax and not do anything. It's a lot more deeper. But that's interesting. And
Yeah, that's right. And those practices can be super powerful, because to not do anything and to work with that, it's like it's its own koan. How do you do not doing, right? And it can be very deconstructive and very, very potent and powerful practice, and it really will work for some people. But what I noticed when I was practicing, and I practiced in a Zen lineage for a while, and I've had lots of people, lots of students that come through that have been in Zen lineages with that kind of instruction. And what I notice is that it works, but it works for a small percentage of people. That most people actually need some kind of they're better supported by some kind of developmental stage approach to meditation, where they're building basic foundational skills and then layering them on top of each other and slowly building up a capacity to do that. What I've seen in the stage-wise approach is people getting much deeper, much faster than in the kind of the simple just sit approach. So I want to make sure that, in talking about this, that what the situation is thank God we have all of this, because we really do need all of this. And some people need that, they don't need the stage-wise thing. They could just run with that kind of just sit zazen. And that's beautiful. And I don't want to take anything away from that. That is wonderful. That happened to not be me, right? I couldn't do that. And so naturally, where I've gravitated towards was something that was a stage-wise approach to that. And now that I've followed the stage-wise approach, mostly when I'm doing my own meditation practice, I am just sitting, right? But the difference is not the practice, it's the practitioner.
Yeah.
Right. So it's who's sitting, right? It's actually, what I do is I just simply drop into non-dual presence and then just sit. And so it's who's sitting that makes the difference, that makes that practice what it is, right? It's not the practice itself, because the practice itself is utterly formless. It has there's no instruction in some sense, right?
Yeah, I'm enjoying. I feel like we're just navigating these depths and we're just going up and down, just like you said. And now I kind of, I feel like we dropped down. I want to kind of go back up a little bit more. And, there's a lot of therapeutic modalities out there. And what is it about internal family systems, which I believe, your parts model is related to? What is it about it that you find most useful when working with coaching clients? And why it seems like there's, of all therapy modalities, this one seems to be very, very popular in a lot of the circles that I move in. It always pops up. So what is it about it, and why is it so helpful, and why is it so useful compared to other therapeutic modalities?
Yeah, so I first learned about IFS in 2003 from my friend Jay Early, who he and his wife Bonnie Weiss were
He
kind
wrote a
of.
book. He wrote a book about it. What was the book? Something
He's written
self.
many books. Yeah,
Ah,
yeah. Jay's book is
self
self-therapy,
therapy. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
self-therapy, right? And it's a
Hmm.
book I still recommend to clients. Um, and the title is a kind of play on words in the sense that he's talking about it's teaching you how to use IFS with yourself. So it's self-therapy, not therapy from a therapist. But in IFS, their word for what I call presence is self with a
Yeah.
capital S. And so it's also therapy done by presence or by self, right? So it's kind of that. So I first learned about IFS then through Jay, and then eventually went through the IFS training, and I think it's a powerful view, to begin to address the inner complexity that we experience, as I was describing earlier, like to recognize that we have different parts of ourselves and that we can actually focus on one part at a time actually makes the complexity navigable. We don't have to deny any other parts, but we don't have to deal with all of them at once. And trying to deal with all of them at once is impossible. It just leads to confusion and to stuckness. But we can deal with that complexity without having to deny any of it by actually working part by part by part, and to see how parts are layered in constellations and how parts interact with each other and pull against each other. And so it's just a really skillful way of navigating what is complex. Plus, when you get into conversation with your parts, I think it's a very elegant interface to the subconscious. So all methods of therapy and coaching will have some way that they help clients to learn something about themselves that they're otherwise unaware of. And so there's something in the subconscious that's true, and when it comes to light, we immediately recognize that it's true. But if we were to just be asked about it, we wouldn't be able to answer. So somehow we have to get access to that. Now, if you're going to go through like somatic psychotherapies, their method is to do, the therapist learns to read the body, and they train for literally years to be able to notice subtle things like how the client is holding their shoulders, or to notice tension in the jaw, or to notice, armoring in the eyes, or different things like that, and somatic therapists can be extremely skillful and can help clients to notice things because of what they can see in the client's body. Brilliant stuff. However, that doesn't help the client learn a capacity to be able to do that for themselves. The client would have to go through years of training to be able to do that. Whereas in parts work, what we can do is we simply we relate to the part from presence, and we ask parts questions like, how are you feeling today? And the part will respond, and we can say, oh, I really can tell you're feeling sad, right? And we can have a conversation. So the way I like to say it is, everybody already knows how to ask questions and listen for answers. We already know how to have a conversation. So what's elegant about this is we're just taking a skill we all have and we're redeploying it in a particular mode that gives access to subconscious truths that we don't have access to. And so IFS is the primary inspiration for how we practice parts work in Aletheia. But the big difference is that IFS doesn't sit within a depth ontology. It basically just recognizes predominantly the depth of parts and a little kind of what I would call like a veneer of the depth of presence and absence, not the full range of that depth like Almas does, for example. So, or that we do in Aletheia, really influenced by Almas. So there are elements of the IFS methodology that we don't do in Aletheia coaching. And we don't do them because actually what we find is that at a certain point in that method, the client will spontaneously drop in depth. And instead of pulling them back into parts and continuing with IFS, what we find more skillful is to shift into process work. And so when we shift into process work and we follow them, then they'll drop into an even deeper depth where we shift into presence work. So what I teach and what I practice in Aletheia is not IFS, but it's clearly influenced and inspired by IFS. But once you start to take these different methods and you nestle them inside of a depth ontology, what you find is that certain aspects of the method are no longer needed, because shifting into a different depth and using that other method is a more skillful way of doing what that part of the method is trying to do.
Yeah. The parts model it is fascinating, and it's interesting when I bring it up or I share it with people that aren't familiar about it, and I guess that people that haven't come across like some of this deeper inner work, and they still have an idea that the psyche is somehow solid, or there's a solid self, and then we start
singular self.
Yeah, singular self.
Yeah,
and you start seeing there's all these pieces. And what's interesting to me is I ran across this idea that the self is actually composed of many different parts from multiple angles, and obviously you have internal family systems. And then I came across the theory of the modular brain, which basically says that certain parts of the brain get turned on in certain relationships in certain times, and then you could have contradictory beliefs. Like in one situation, this is what you want to do. In another situation, you want to do a completely opposite thing. And then the meditation teacher Chol Dasa, he has a book, The Mind Illuminated, and there he talks about subminds, and he basically says these subminds, like the mind is made up of subminds, and they're always kind of beefing with each other. They're always like, oh, I want this, until you get mind unification, when all those conflicts kind of dissolve, and you drop down into into deep presence and eventually non-duality.
Right. That's what happens in a good meditation practice. If meditation is functioning, what happens is we drop down through these depths spontaneously, right? And we drop from a depth, the depth, what I call the depth of parts, where there is this kind of sense of separation, where we can be embroiled in yogic and Buddhist philosophy, it would be called the three poisons, or in Tibetan Buddhism, it would be called the five poisons. They add another two. The poisons are avoidance, attachment, and delusion. If you add the other two, it's, add pride and jealousy on top of that. So, we get embroiled in avoidance. Like we want to avoid feeling certain things, or we want to attach to feeling other ways, right? We get into all of that at the depth of parts. But if we actually are practicing our meditation practice, all those poisons kind of just relax. That we don't change them, we don't counter them, we relax them. And as they relax, we gain freedom from that, and we drop more and more into presence, more and more into our wholeness and completeness, more and more into our depth. What will often happen, though, for people is that they get shackled at the depth of parts because they have a part that's really trying to have them do the meditation right, like correctly. That's saying, fix this, do this, and so there's all kinds of, you're doing a practice, but there are parts that are trying to improve how you're doing the practice, because you're apparently not getting from this practice what is supposed to happen. You're still feeling a little bit deficient, like you're not sure if you're doing the practice right. You're not sure if you're, it's like, oh, I'm doing this practice because I need to improve on this thing. I want to be more happy. I want to be more peaceful. I'm not feeling peaceful. I'm actually feeling very turbulent inside. Like I must be doing it wrong. We get wrapped around all of this, and then the practice, our meditation actually doesn't deepen, right? So actually having skillful means to work with the practice at each one of those depths actually will allow us to just drop in, and the dropping in is spontaneous. It happens by relaxing in, right? It happens by stopping trying to improve what we're doing, right? Which is really the intuition that you can get from that most advanced stage of meditation, that non-meditation or zazen, that just sitting. The intuition is stop trying to fix yourself, right? Stop trying to improve yourself. I know it's a good intention, but it doesn't work. What they're trying to do, in fact, is they're trying to get you in your meditation to shift from self-improvement into unfoldment. It's actually what they're trying to do. And if you can make that switch immediately, great. But usually it takes some working with parts that are trying to improve, with parts work, unfolding, all that kind of stuff to make that shift, right? But unfoldment wants to happen. Unfoldment is, the way I like to say it, and it is that the vast majority of the transformation that you have ever experienced in your life, and I'm speaking for every human being, the vast majority of transformation we experience comes from unfoldment. And by vast, like 99%. Such a small amount of transformation actually comes from self-improvement. And so the thing is that we effort so hard to improve ourselves, but how much do we effort to unfold ourselves? Like, it just happens. So then the question should be, how do we create the conditions for unfoldment? It's clear we don't do unfoldment. How do we create the conditions for unfoldment? Well, one of the chief conditions is stop trying to improve. Stop trying to mess with yourself. Stop manipulating yourself, right? That's the intuition that we see in its fullest expression in that deeper stage of meditation, right?
Yeah, it's like when we get out of the way, that's when the magic happens.
That's a great way to say it. Yeah. It's like learning how to get out of the way of unfoldment and let it happen. And the surprise is that instead of, some people will say, well, hey, if I like stop trying to improve myself, they think of it in terms of throwing your hands up in the air and saying, I give up. Like, I'm just not going to do anything. And I look at these as like two extremes. Like, improving yourself is like, you're in there, you're working, you're efforting, you're doing stuff. It's good intention, right? But it doesn't really work out often. Throwing your hands up in the air and saying, I give up, and just backing off and disengaging, well, that doesn't work either. And in fact, both of these are extremes of disengagement. So when you're trying to improve things, if you're trying to solve a problem or improve in some way, what you actually have to do, and this is why improvement doesn't work, is you actually have to put blinders on and not pay attention to most of life, most of yourself, narrow your view, and then work in that kind of way to optimize something. But what you wind up doing in that optimization, if it succeeds, is you inevitably sub-optimize something else in your life. And so then you succeed here, and then you look up and you go, oh, I got to go over there. And it's like playing whack-a-mole. It's like self-improvement whack-a-mole. It's like every time you get somewhere, something else goes off, right? And that keeps us in that self-improvement hamster wheel, that trap, that just, the more self-improvement, the more we need self-improvement, right? So in these two extremes of disengagement, the middle path is actually what I call deep participation. And that's the condition for unfoldment. So we actually have to participate in this deep way with life, like really feeling what we're feeling, really sensing our body, really being right here, really opening up to the complexity of life exactly the way it is, participating fully with everything we have in life. And when we do that, we create the conditions in which unfoldment naturally happens. And what we find is that we're a whole human being. We find resourcefulness, we find capacity, we find creativity. Like, we can come up with a creative response to something, right? So that deep participation, it's both, that's the work of it, but it's the work to open up to the grace of unfolding, right?
Yeah, if we're playing with a paradox, Steve. Like, we got to take complete responsibility, but there's no one here to take responsibility. And
right.
And honestly, like what you're doing with Aletheia in your approach, and it makes me think of this quote from Carl Rogers, and it was, the curious paradox is, when I accept myself, then I can change. And it's this completely paradoxical notion, and I feel like that's what you're speaking about with unfoldment. And the other piece, that it just seems like the unfoldment is like, it's happening on its own, right? Like, it's happening anyway on its own. But then there is this container, there's this space, or there's this like holding that somehow facilitates it. And it's like this very subtle process. And it seems like that's what you're tapping into. It could almost, from a sense, seem like, oh, why would I need a coach? Why would I need anybody to do this? The unfoldment is just doing itself. But then there's these subtle nuances that you're able to hold that somehow facilitates this process. At least that's how I'm seeing it.
I think that's right on. And I think you're right that does go back to Carl Rogers. I first learned about this kind of paradox of change, through Gestalt psychology, which Rogers influenced. But this whole idea that when we have a change agenda for ourselves, what we tend to do is we tend to evoke the resistance to that change, which is what gets us stuck. And so we see this all the time with the self-improvement approach, is that it actually evokes inner resistance. Like, just again, think about New Year's resolutions. It's like we set up, we want to diet, we want to lose weight, we want to do something. And then that seems to activate all the parts of us that want us to eat dessert and want us to have fun and don't want us to exercise. And then we're like fighting with ourselves, fighting, and efforting and discipline. And, that's a sure sign that we're in this self-improvement mode. And it's not that nobody gets anything from that. Like, we can get something from that, but it takes such degrees of discipline and efforting. And it seems like the little bit of payoff seems to only convince us that we're on the right track, that we just need to do it more, better, faster. Like, and this is a commentary on our culture, right? So like, how much of us are like, we're not quite happy enough or fulfilled enough, and we get just enough of a taste of something that we feel like, well, if I just do it more, or just do it better, or just do it faster, that somehow I'll get to that place. And instead, this whole unfoldment paradigm is recognizing that project never fully works out, and recognizing that rather than just giving up, we have another alternative. And it turns out to be the primordial kind of change, the kind of change that's gotten us to this place, the original kind of change, which was the unfolding kind of change, the unfolding of wholeness into more wholeness. And that actually, when we begin to leverage that, what we do is we come into the present moment, we come into this deep participation with what's here. And then there's another kind of change that we start to learn to leverage. And it's a kind of change in which we become part of the complex systems that we're living in. And we leverage the emergent properties of complexity, right? So instead of feeling overwhelmed by complexity, we surf complexity. It's like we style it. It's like, okay, yeah, this is complex, but let's just start navigating this. Now, that requires a different way of living life. Like, you can't live life in this, way where we're insisting on it being a certain way, where we want to form it and shape it according to our desires, right? Like that whole modernist sense that comes from the assumed separation of culture and nature, that we're somehow separate from the world, and the world is here for us to form and shape into something that we want, to fulfill the desires that we have. Like that, we have to let go of that. But in fact, trying to do that is what's got us kind of into a pickle in our culture and in our times, right? And it's like, the more we struggle with that, the more energy we consume, the more energy we put into that. Well, we're literally burning up our energy support, supplies all over the place. Clearly, it's like this. So what I'm talking about in terms of this shift from the self-improvement to unfoldment is not just for us as individuals. It's for us as relationships or teams or organizations or cultures. Right? There is a real need for us to begin to shift and to remember, really, because it's an original primordial kind of change that unfoldment is to remember this and to actually learn to be able to trust unfoldment, which is nothing more than trusting reality. And I know that it seems like reality is a dangerous place. And so the last thing we want to do is trust. We want to defend and protect. Like all of that seems to make rational sense, and it seems to be a good intention, but we really have to stand back and ask ourselves, how's it working out? Like, is this really working to do life this way for ourselves as individuals or relationships or teams or organizations or cultures? is that really working? Is there wisdom in that? And I would say, in fact, those things close us off to wisdom. That in fact, when we shift into an unfolding paradigm, that we suddenly become wiser. There's a wisdom in how to navigate the situations that we're in that can only be accessed through deeply participating in the situations that we're in. And that's what I believe this is the core transformation that we need in our culture. And it gives us a different orientation, a different perspective on so many different problems that we face.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm curious, is there anything you wish that I would have asked you that I didn't, or is there anything else you would like to share before we wrap up?
This has been a great conversation. First of all, it's fun to lay out some of these ideas and just see the resonances that you're picking up on. I just think to end on this is like sort of like picking up the thread I was just in. It's like we're in an age in which our culture values information and knowledge, and doesn't seem to value wisdom. My friend, cognitive scientist John Vervaeke, talks about asking his students questions like, "Where do you go for information and knowledge?" And of course, we have loads of answers for that. Mostly they're the internet, right? The internet, books, schools, universities. Where do you go for wisdom, right? And his students, and I'm guessing probably like most of us, would kind of be stumped by that question. Like, where do we go for wisdom? We've lost the valuing of wisdom in our culture. And it's been overshadowed by content, by information, by knowledge. And of course, information and knowledge is really helpful. So I don't want to demonize those things. I just want to almost like shine a light in the direction of wisdom and say, there's something here that in these times we need to cultivate wisdom. And, we gather knowledge so as not to be ignorant, but we cultivate wisdom so as not to be foolish. And there's a lot of foolishness in our world right now. And so, where can we actually learn to cultivate wisdom? Where do we learn to access wisdom? And it's shifting from and opening into this unfolding paradigm is the primary way that we gain access to wisdom. And wisdom, not that can be written in aphorisms and things like that, although you could, but the wisdom that arises through deep participation about how to deal with this very situation, right? So there's a timeliness and a situatedness to wisdom. And it requires that we dive into this present moment, that we dive into the relationships, that we embody ourselves, that we really, really be here with all of ourselves, our body, mind, and heart. So I think that's the thing that I kind of a message that I'd like to communicate here is we live in times in which we need wisdom. We desperately need wisdom. But we also live in times in which the way our culture is going is moving us away from that. So I view the work that I'm doing inside of Aletheia, and that I think through the coaches that come through our school as bringing a kind of contemporary wisdom curriculum. How do we actually learn to do this that brings the best that we have in terms of psychological understanding with the best that we have in terms of spiritual practice, and bringing all of that together in an integrated form that can be brought into the corporate world or organizational world or nonprofits or people's lives, where perhaps the wisdom traditions that we've had on the planet couldn't as easily make that transition. Like, you can't walk into corporate America and just start teaching Buddhist practices. Many people aren't Buddhist, and they would feel offended by that, actually. They would feel that there was some proselytizing going on there. But you can go in and ask people where they are and help them get deeper contact with themselves and with their situations in ways that help them pragmatically navigate those. And I think that is what a wisdom tradition needs to look like in this day and age. It needs to look like something that has that pragmatic aspect to it. And I think that's what we're doing, and we're continuing to evolve that and unfold that.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful message to leave off on. And, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I have so much more questions. I'm considering doing the Aletheia training, the level 1. So I just want to thank you for coming on here, and I hope that we can speak sometime again.
I would love that. And I love the work that you're doing. I saw, the different people that you're gathering and talking to. And so you're hosting a really important conversation here. It's like, can we come together and talk about these things? And so thanks for your work. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Steve March. Talk soon. Take care.
Take care.